long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School in Northern Kentucky. Welcome to the Midweek Show, Ken.
Thanks. It is great to be back again.
You know, it is always kind of fun. We've gotten to know each other really well kind of through doing the show. And so I know one of the things that we're going to be doing here in just a few days is we have a live Politics Guys, and it's not going to be me and Ken. It's going to be Mike and Jay, but they're going to be doing that on May 4th through the CastBox podcast app. So again, that's going to be on Saturday, May 4th at 3 p.m. Mike and Jay are going to be doing a live show. But today, Ken, we're actually going to be taking on some listener questions. We've got a backlog in the mailroom. If I could show you a picture in the mailroom, there'd be lots of things. Well, it's digital, so you could just see all of the digital mail piling up. And so, listeners, today, Ken and I will be taking on your questions. And so, should we dig right in, Ken? Are you ready?
Oh, yeah.
Let's do it. So our first question comes from Zach, and he asks this. With most presidential candidates taking on the crumbling infrastructure, education costs, and other national policy stances, why do we never hear any candidates taking on eradicating the growing, significant homeless person population we are facing in the United States? Is it a matter of cost or the policy involved that is stopping the U.S. from trying to eradicate it? We, I mean humans, are so eager to donate millions and now billions of dollars to rebuild a burned down 800-year-old church. But when it comes to our homeless population, it is often considered a not my problem topic. So Ken, I think in some ways Zach here might be talking a little bit about our Democratic hopefuls. So I'm going to let you start off with this one. What do you think about Zach's question?
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's the policy level and then there's the politics level. So, I mean, from a policy level, the United States government does have a Department of Housing and Urban Development. Part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's mandate is to assist homeless people as well as people who are at imminent risk of homelessness and people fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. And so there's the legal infrastructure in place for all that. Now, what can be done with that legal infrastructure partly depends on how dedicated the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is to those issues, and partly depends on how much money Congress is willing to appropriate at any given time. And I think there's a general partisan divide. I don't know if, Trey, if you'll disagree with me about that, but I think Democrats tend to put higher priority on that than Republicans and are willing to allocate more money for those kind of programs and are willing to have their secretaries be a little bit more aggressive in trying to solve those kind of problems. On the political level, I think one of the reasons you don't hear all the Democratic candidates talking about that particular issue as much in the early campaigning for the presidential nomination is because I think substantially all Democrats are interested in allocating more money to those problems. So it's not an area that they would hugely differentiate themselves from one another. But also, it's not an area where, the swing voters are really in play on that. I think when you hear them talking, when you hear the candidates talking, they're trying to really look for positions that they think will either differentiate themselves from one another or be ways of getting more votes in the general. And I just think this is one where there's more of a partisan divide between the two parties than one where there's an intra-democratic divide within the Democrats.
Well, I think you're right, Ken. I'm not going to disagree. I think that on the Republican side, the tools that are employed to attempt to help with homelessness are not specifically targeted at homelessness. Now, right? My guess is that you're probably going to say, well, that's a cop-out of an answer. But that really is our position is that you have, by making the institutional market system as best you can, you minimize those issues. So, Ken, I don't disagree with you on that front. But where I think Zach might be coming from a little bit here, and maybe I'm reading into this, maybe not, but having come recently from Daytona Beach, Florida, where we have a significant issue in Volusia County. That's where Daytona Beach is located. One of the actual major dividing points in the Democratic Party in Volusia County was over the question of the response to the homeless population in the county. Do we want to and how to and how to deal with that? And it was interesting because kind of the young Democrats of Volusia County, who I actually spoke to a couple of times, they took a very different kind of line on the homeless question, and they were really kind of fed up with not so much Republicans from whom they kind of expected it, but what they kind of saw as being the mainline Democratic candidates. Now, in this case, we're talking about local elections. So I know that you're kind of pointing to that infrastructure that's already in place, Ken. But do you think that maybe do you think that's part of Zach's question might be, why aren't Democrats more progressive on it, maybe? And do you kind of have a response to that? Kind of the Volusia County division question, I think, might be kind of what Zach is getting at here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I'm not certain, but I think homelessness has different causes in different parts of the country, depending on what the cost of living is, right? So that in the northeastern cities in the West Coast, where it's very expensive, you hear people talk a lot about affordable housing, but affordable housing could mean affordable to working class people, not necessarily just to people who are in abject poverty. And then in places that are less expensive, and I take it that Daytona is probably one of these places.
Yes, it is. It's a very
less expensive. That the homelessness problem is really just an aspect of the problem of deep poverty, right? Nobody would be homeless unless they were in deep poverty. So that those questions become a little bit more inseparable. How do you solve the poverty problem versus how do you solve the homelessness problem? So I would guess that that's maybe some of the answer, but I'm not sure if that's exactly responsive or not.
Yeah. So Zach, in short, I think we've kind of taken on your question there a little bit, but I think regardless of whether you're coming at it from a Democratic or Republican point of view, it's not a particularly easy problem to address. And the last part of your question there, when you say, and I know this is kind of on everybody's mind in the wake of the tragedy at Notre Dame, is really that I don't think that the homelessness versus the church is all that unusual, in that we do know in the social science literature that in episodic events, so there's different ways that things can be framed, right? And one way things can be framed is what's called an episodic way, and that's when you're looking at one particular concrete instance of something, right? So if you want to talk about, say, the student loan crisis, an episodic frame would be to go find Susie Q and say, how has this affected your life? And we would kind of follow it and trace it through her life, how student loans have harmed her. And then a thematic approach is when you kind of look at something from a broader perspective. And what we know to be the case is that we as humans are far, far, far more sympathetic, willing to give, and emotionally pulled upon in terms of a single concrete instance. In other words, excuse me, the episodic frame. Whereas homelessness, almost by its very nature, is not easily an episodic frame. Rather, it's kind of this thematic frame. It's this, well, there's this many people who are homeless, and this many people without a house, and we all kind of go, oh, that's bad. But you don't attach to it in the same way, because it's not this single concrete instance that you can put your fingers around. And the church burning down, that's a singular image that you're going to have. It's a sadness, and so I think a bit of human nature is also at play here, in the way that these things inevitably must be framed because of how we approach them. So that's kind of my addendum to your answer. So why does this get more coverage? I'm going to say it's because it pulled on more people's heartstrings, not because it's a bigger tragedy, but because of the nature of the frame itself.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing I'd add is I also think $1 billion, which is what's been raised for Notre Dame, that's a lot of money to fix up Notre Dame, but that would actually be just pennies. It would be chump change compared to the amount of money it would cost to solve the homelessness problem. So I think it's easier to respond to problems where the sums of money that can be raised through public awareness are actually adequate. But I don't think that's really in the cards for homelessness.
Yeah, I think you're right about that as well, Ken. Zach, thank you for the question. We hope you'll ask more. Ryan asks the following. He says, what are your opinions of the idea that civility is an expression of privilege and a tool of oppression? I've been hearing this idea more and more from those involved in different forms of activism. The argument is this. The system has been created by those in power, pushes marginalized populations to or even beyond the breaking point. Then, when they express their outrage at grievous injustices, they are dismissed and ignored because they aren't expressing their issues in a manner deemed appropriate by those in power. That, because of their background, this passion and outrage is the way that their environment has conditioned them to respond to their circumstances. Contrast against those who come from positions of privilege, who are more likely to have been taught how to use the existing structures to achieve their desired ends, while at the same time the system has been set up to be more responsive to those who already hold power. So in other words, is the system itself what is making us be civil? Ought we to be civil? He goes on to say, I particularly like this question for your show because the premise of the politics guys is that we ought to be able to have productive civil conversations about politics where we all presumably would be willing to change our opinions, or at the very least understand those with differing opinions. So are you open to the possibility that the version of discourse you aim to achieve is potentially perpetuating a situation that is shutting out those who need to join the conversation most? Or do you think this whole idea is just hogwash? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Love the show. So Ryan, that's a big question. And so I'm going to do what every good professor does and say, pass, Ken.
All right. Well, I'm open to the possibility, but I wouldn't go all the way to rejecting civility. That's for sure. So, I mean, I think it's sort of an old motif. What he's really asking is sort of the idea of no peace, no justice, no peace. Right? He's saying, is it are people who are oppressed and who are not given their fair share of society's resources and benefits, at some point, should they just stop using the ordinary channels of persuasion and legal recourse and start using other means? I think civility tends to be more effective. I mean, if you look at things like Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in the United States, or Mahatma Gandhi's success in getting the British Empire out of India, it seems to me that if you are an oppressed population, you're not going to be able to muscle your way out of that. You're really going to have to change the public opinion of the majority that's oppressing you. And I do think civility is a good way to do that. I take civility to include not just attempts at public persuasion, but also attempts to use proper legal recourse. So I see things like the litigation in Brown versus Board of Education that led to desegregation of public schools in America as being civil because it proceeded through ordinary legal mechanisms and court mechanisms rather than some kind of public disturbances or something. But, you can see examples of the other, or even mixed examples. If you look at the way the Troubles in Northern Ireland ended, I think the campaign of terrorism created a conditions where people wanted that campaign of terrorism to stop, and then there's room to negotiate things like the Good Friday Agreement. So I can't say incivility never works, but I think civility is a nicer tool, and it's probably a more effective tool generally.
I think you're probably right about that, Ken, but I think part of what Ryan here, and again, maybe I'm reading into you, Ryan, so write back and ask us if I'm hearing this wrong, is I think sometimes we're talking about the language itself that's being used, less so, say, non-ordinary channels, like not rioting per se, but although, I mean, that would be a, kind of the yellow vest movement in France. So I guess, Ryan, here the question becomes is, what do you think are the primary structures that are holding society together? And inside of your answer, I kind of hear a bit of that. That's kind of there's a partial Marxist view that suggests that the defining feature of society is one between those who have and between those who have not. And while I'm not going to go as far as some to say that there aren't people who don't have and there aren't those who have not, I don't think that's the defining feature of a society. I think that there can be, it's too long of an answer here to delve into, but I don't think that what kind of that Marxist superstructure between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat really defines societal life. I think other things do. And so because I reject that underlying premise, and not just on its face, but rather because of the evidence of it that we won't get into right now. But because I reject that premise, I reject a lot of that kind of inherited thinking. And I know inside of the many activist circles that kind of paradigm is popular, but once you reject that, I think that you can then have questions about civility, and I think it becomes easier to answer. Kind of on the bonus show, Ken and I were talking about morality in candidates, and I think it's possible to have civil debates with people with whom we disagree. And even if I had so in other words, even if Ken and I shouted at each other, I'm not really sure that we would do anything different with each other's opinions, other than maybe entrench them further, which maybe, again, I think might agree with you. Ken, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just said the same things you did, but I was talking about a bigger scale and you were talking about a more interpersonal scale. But I think generally, whether it's in interpersonal communications or whether it's in ways of thinking about shaping mass public opinion, less powerful groups don't really have a lot of other choices. I mean, I think they're going to have to, if they don't persuade the larger groups to agree with them, they're not typically going to be able to achieve their objectives. And so I think civility tends to be the most effective tool in persuasion.
Well, and if you're going to suggest otherwise, I think you have to at some point undo democracy. Because, again, if you think that things are so mitigated against a particular group that it's impossible to have it be voted differently, then really your only choice at that point would be some kind of violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I was talking about Northern Ireland.
Exactly.
I think it was partly effective, I think. So, I mean, I think, you can't look at that and say, well, the Troubles were a terrible idea, because I think they did help set the stage for the Good Friday Agreement. So I think sometimes, yeah, you are talking about violence, and I took that to be part of the question: is why shouldn't people just say that they've had enough and look for extra legal channels or violent channels to achieve change? And I'm not going to say that never works, but I'll just say I think generally that doesn't work, and it creates a host of problems of its own.
Yeah. So why don't we move on to, I hope we've answered your question. Marcus on Facebook writes the following. He says, I'd be interested to hear you discuss the rising cost of college compared to wages, even when factoring in inflation. How much culpability do colleges themselves have in this consequential trend? In my undergraduate experience, including meetings with administrators and trustees, it seemed to me that two things could be true simultaneously. First, the extracurricular opportunities and experiences many colleges offer, along with capital investments, have far exceeded, to the detriment of both cost and focus, all in the name of competing for branding and students. Secondly, the relative value of college as a degree has dropped as a higher percentage of society has attained said degree, and on the surface positive development, but one that also makes the rising cost of college that much more difficult to cope with. So, I mean, we both spend a lot of time on college campuses and have. So now, Ken, obviously you're coming at this but you're right next door to Northern Kentucky University. So he seems to be kind of targeting here, Marcus, the undergraduate experience. But of course, that bleeds in to graduate degrees, including the JD. What do you think about Marcus's question, Ken?
It's complex, and I'll limit my remarks only to undergraduate education. Although I do work in legal education, which is graduate education. But I think there's a lot of underlying questions that are implicit in that question. One is how many people should go to college. One is how much should taxpayers subsidize college, and one is how career focused versus how more generally focused college should be. And I think different people will give different answers to all those questions, but depending on what your answers to all those questions would be, I mean, they're all relevant ultimately to the question of how much should college cost. I think that the idea about linking it to wages sort of implicitly assumes that the purpose of college is to earn you a certain wage. And if you look at that as being the purpose, then I don't think it's a problem that it's too expensive. I mean, people could then decide for themselves, right? Whether they'll either go or not go, depending on whether they think it's going to be worth the financial investment and the investment in time. So that seems to me that that's not a public policy problem. That might lead to a lot of people concluding, well, it's not worth it to me to go to college because the amount of money and time it would cost me wouldn't pay off in terms of the wage. But I think then if you look at it from that perspective, you should just say, well, then don't go to college. What's the problem? Whereas if you think of it as being an investment in the citizenry, not just in the job force, but in the citizenry, then maybe I think the public should be stepping up more to subsidize that more. If we think we all benefit from a higher percentage of the population being better educated, and that yields a better society, then subsidies, I think, should be higher and costs should be brought down so that accessibility can be there. But I think the narrative that links higher ed's value to the wages it can get you really necessarily leads to me to the conclusion that it's not a problem if it costs a lot. That just means that, just like a Mercedes-Benz, it costs a lot. And, I don't have one. I don't see what the problem is, right? And so that's how I would think about that.
That's thoughtful, Ken. So, Marcus, one of the things that I would suggest, I have worked in a number of different kinds of institutions, and one of the things that always strikes me is how lumped together undergraduate education has been. The last institution for which I worked, Daytona State College, you can actually go to Daytona State, depending on if you're in state or not. You can go look this up. You might not believe me, but for about $2,700 a year. And that's because it was primarily a 2-year institution, although there were we definitely had 4-year degrees. So when we talk about the cost of college, it's kind of like talking about the cost of tablets. The iPad Pro isn't a really expensive tablet, but that doesn't mean you wouldn't want to say that all tablets therefore cost $1,000. So one of the things you have to kind of ask is, well, what different kinds of colleges are costing what and why? And that's one of the things that you have to unpackage. Now, one of the areas that Ken hasn't talked about is one of the correlations between the increase in the cost of college there's been a dedicated amount of money that has to be spent on colleges. So when you don't actually give money directly to the colleges, right, the subsidies that Ken's talking about, but instead give them to students through to college, you actually end up increasing the overall price of the good or the service over time. So for example, if the average cost of a tablet today is $500 and then everybody gets $100 from the government, every other year to purchase a tablet, slowly but surely what will end up happening is the average cost will go up $100. And so what's happened is that most of the funding support that colleges receive are now tied through student loans and through student subsidies, not in investment in those actual public institutions. And so as a result, those prices have gone up. So it's not just the extracurricular, although that has happened. And I'll say another one that you don't mention, and I think Ken's being nice, is that the administrative costs of colleges have gone extremely high. The number of administrators per student has increased significantly over time, to the detriment of tenure-tracked faculty, so that today you're far more likely to have a ton of administrators running around, but being taught by a kind of a migrant adjunct population. So it's a complicated question.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I don't want to defend administrators because I think there's extreme administrative bloat and it's mostly unnecessary. But I will also say, in a slight defense of them, that there's actually more that the public expects colleges to do than used to be the case. So, when I went to college, I'm older than you. You didn't have offices of things like disability and things like that, and now people actually expect those kind of services to be provided. So there has to be probably a little bit more administration to meet current expectations of what kind of services schools can deliver to students, but not anywhere near justifying the bloat. And I also think there's been a lot of construction bloat, which is highly unnecessary. And, in fact, we're moving towards a world where more and more students want to take at least part of their education online. You don't need as much space on the campuses for, as in the past. And yet, all of these universities, I think there's a lot of pressure on them all the time. They find it easiest to raise money if they're going to put up a new building. They find it easier to get the legislatures to give them money if they're going to put up a new building. And they just and there's always some local interests in the construction trades and stuff that are always pushing for that kind of thing because there's money to be made. And I just think that is so. I definitely agree that colleges do bear some of the responsibility, both in terms of construction trends and in terms of administrative bloat. But I don't think you're going to ever make college affordable to people without subsidies, even by tamping back down on that stuff so much. I think there either has to be a public investment piece, or the price has to just go high, and then the only people that'll go are the people that can actually that'll be an investment return to will actually go. But you'll box out a lot of people then.
Now, I don't disagree. My suggestion was rather the way that you're allocating those dollars needs to actually go directly to the public institutions as opposed to being tied. But
I do agree with that, although I think you might need both.
Now, the last little bit of that, though, is I'll say there's also been and you were talking about kind of the expectations of the public. I think one of the other shifts, and there's a significant amount of higher education to suggest this. As a matter of fact, it's one of my pet peeves, is the idea that every individual, every kid, every college student, right, they all have an equal amount of opportunity to succeed. And in other words, that the only variable is the professor, the faculty member, the school teacher, et cetera, and or the institutional structure of the institution. And if everything was just perfect, then everybody would have the same kind of outcome. And so to respond to that, you were talking about disability services, but I think, kind of better examples would be the additional kinds of hand-holding student services that we now have to try to have students complete who don't want to complete. There's this idea that every student really just wants to get it done. And as a faculty member, I can say that's simply not the case. And I think that you're right that those kinds of that has led to an increase in administrative bloat. And I'll put in 2 cents for my own school. I now work at a private university, at Oklahoma Christian University, and one of the ways that we have tried to keep costs down is, and we have for a while now, we actually put a ban on ourselves, right? Because we're a private institution, we can do whatever we want to do. On building new buildings. Instead, we say, look, let's just update the things that we have. So instead of creating something new, it's easier to raise funds for that. It really is. Yeah. But our president and our faculty all felt very strongly that, that's not really what we ought to be doing. There's better investments, and let's go after those more difficult dollars. And not every school is going to take that track. Our tuition will be a little bit lower as a result, but again, we're private, so we can make those kinds of determinations.
I applaud your institution for doing that. Every institution should do that.
I see. I agree. It's not often that you applaud your own institution or your own president. Usually faculty, we're a little contentious with administrators, right? And this is one where like, yes, yeah, fully agree. So Dr. DeStager, I agree with you, sir. He's the president of OC. So anyway, but yeah, and so Marcus, I hope that we've answered your question. That was a very thoughtful one. I think we probably have just enough time for a really quick last question, Ken. And this is actually one that we touched on our Saturday show, but I thought we might still just tack it on here. And that is a different Zach writes, quote, if the Democrats in Congress make moves to impeach President Trump, do you think the Republicans in both Congress and Senate could or would consider voting to remove him to heal the black eye on the Republican Party that has become to restore the status quo? While I don't support President Trump or Vice President Pence, I think the international image of the U.S. would be somewhat better if we had a Pence in office rather than Trump. Pence is at least somewhat civil. Thoughts? Zach, here's my quick answer. I have long worked for Republicans. I was part of the college Republicans, and the likelihood that Republicans are going to vote against Trump, and this pains me to say, is somewhere around zero. And that's because they have the presidency. They think they might win it again, and it is incredibly difficult, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, to want to do something that would effectively harm you in an upcoming election, no matter how, internationally or morally upstanding it might be. There's my short, kind of sweet answer. Ken, do you have any addition to that?
Yeah, I agree. There's no chance that 19 Republicans in the Senate would vote against Trump, which is what it would take. So he could not be removed. But I guess there's a slight chance that 3 or 4 might, and so there'd be the symbolically, the majority of the Senate might have voted to remove him, but it takes a 2/3 vote.
Right. Yeah. And again, even, as a matter of fact,
You don't even count the 3 or 4?
I'm thinking about it. And I'm thinking, maybe 2, maybe 2,
yeah, maybe
3.
Murkowski, maybe Romney,
yeah,
maybe Collins. Yeah, it's hard to get all the way up to 4 here.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, but I think probably he would be acquitted by a majority of the Senate. But the worst thing that could be happen is he'd be symbolically rejected by losing to the majority. But
And
he certainly
Zach,
won't lose
I'll
the
be
2/3.
honest, and Ken, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not even sure you would get a straight Democratic, convict vote.
You're thinking Manchin might not.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Yeah,
I'm
who
thinking
else
there
besides
might.
Manchin?
Well, I'm thinking that, there's a couple of different Senate seats that are going to be up in 2020 where, they're kind of cusp seats. I'm not sure. Again, you might, if nothing else, just not being home that day would be useful. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't think of any others. I mean, I live in Ohio. It is a Trump state, but the Democratic senator from here, Sherrod Brown, he'd be a certainty to vote for removal. So I think it's not just the fact that a state is close doesn't necessarily determine it. I think it would have to be an overwhelming Trump state, and I think Manchin may be the only Democratic senator from an overwhelmingly Trump state.
Okay, well, either way, we're not going to get to those votes, Zach, and whether or not that heals anything or not will probably end up not mattering much, because I don't think that's a pragmatic reality, good, bad, or otherwise. So, as a reminder, Politics Guys listeners, before we sign off on the show, that we are doing something new on May 4th, on Saturday, May 4th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Mike and Jay are going to be doing the show live. That's right, live. What are they going to do? I'm not positive. Will craziness ensue? Probably. Because this will be our first ever Politics Guys live show. So if you want to catch it on May 4th at 3 p.m., you're going to have to download the CastBox podcast app. It's Mike's favorite, and he uses it all the time. I've gotten it. As a matter of fact, I mentioned it on the weekend show as well. I'm beta testing it. That's not my favorite yet. I don't know. But it's the only way you're going to be able to listen to the Politics Guys live on May 4th. At 3 p.m. I hope you'll join us then. And I likewise hope that you'll join us next weekend. But for now, Ken, it's been wonderful doing this show with you. The executive producers of The Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. I hope you'll join us then.